Welcome to What Lies Beyond with your host, Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal, and the post-material future. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com. Today, I talked with Bethany Butzer, PhD. Bethany writes, teaches, and conducts research in the fields of positive psychology and transpersonal psychology, which emphasize the development of human strength and potential. She received her MA in clinical psychology and her PhD in social psychology from the University of Western Ontario, Canada. From 2013 to 2015, Bethany was a postdoctoral research fellow at Harvard Medical School, where she studied yoga and mindfulness for youth. From 2016 to 2022, Bethany was a lecturer in the School of Psychology at the University of New York in Prague. Bethany is currently a lecturer for the Aleph Trust MSc program in Consciousness, Spirituality and Transpersonal Psychology. Bethany's research focuses on synchronicity, parapsychology and ecopsychology. We also both teach on the Trust's Approaches to Consciousness short course, which is part of their master's program. On today's show, we talked about the current state of play in consciousness studies. We also talked a little about materialist and post-materialist approaches to consciousness and Bethany's special interest in synchronicity. We finished with the discussion of Bethany's idea that humanity might currently be going through an ecological dark night of the soul, and how transpersonal psychology might help. So, Bethany, how long have you and I known one another now? It's been a few years, hasn't it?
Yeah, I guess maybe four or 5 years, perhaps.
Okay, so that was via the Approaches to Consciousness course, which you started off as a student, didn't you? So,
yes, exactly. You were my tutor in that course at first, yes.
And then you ended up teaching on it. And but let's go further back than that. How did you get interested in consciousness studies to start off with?
It's an interesting question because in some ways I actually don't know. I actually feel like I was born into this world with an interest in life's big questions. At a very young age, by the age of 4, I was asking my family members, where do stars come from? And where do people go when they die? And what are we? And my family was very afraid of this. And I was constantly asking why, to the point that my mother used to take me around on a bicycle, like in one of those little kiddie seats on the back of a bicycle, and ride me around on the bicycle. And I would still be talking and asking questions, but she just wouldn't answer me, and she would just let it go. And that was the way to just ignore my never-ending questions. So I think that this is partly why I ended up in academia generally, was just because I enjoy research, I enjoy asking questions, I'm just very curious in that way. And of course, ended up in psychology, where consciousness, on the one hand, is a major feature of psychology if you think about it, but on the other hand, it's actually not taught very often in either undergraduate or graduate programs. So I think I took one course in consciousness in my undergraduate degree many years ago, and then for the most part forgot about it until further along in grad school, where I started to become less and less happy with the mainstream education that I was receiving. I mean, it was a great education. I was taught many wonderful things by many wonderful people, but there was a way in which consciousness and the transpersonal weren't included at all. They were taboo. You weren't allowed to even think about the idea that consciousness might not be part of like something that's generated by the brain, basically. And so what I guess my shorter way of answering this would be that I've had experiences throughout my life that you could classify as paranormal, psi phenomena, synchronicities.
Yep.
And I felt that my professional life, I often say this, my professional life was gaslighting my personal life, because my professional life was telling me that these things I was experiencing weren't real. They weren't part of science. and needed to be ignored. And it was a growing dissatisfaction with that led me to the Aleph Trust consciousness program, their MSc program, and the course that I ended up taking with you. And so it was a long and winding road, but I eventually got here.
So yes, I remember when you were taking the course, but also when you started teaching the approaches to consciousness course, you were actually teaching a mainstream, was it neuroscience course in consciousness? So can you tell me a bit about the difference between the mainstream approaches and what the Aleph Trust, what you found in the Aleph Trust, maybe?
Yeah, I was teaching so I live in Prague, and I was teaching at the University of New York in Prague, which is, it's an American university, but in Prague, very mainstream, but it's a small satellite location. So because it's smaller, they were actually a little more open to some of these different types of views. And so I proposed to them that I would teach a course called Mind, Body, Consciousness. And so I developed this course myself. And in that course, I taught about mainstream approaches to consciousness. So a lot of neuroscientific approaches. I taught about psychoneuroimmunology, the placebo effect, etc. But I also slipped in some classes on parapsychology and transpersonal psychology. And so there wasn't necessarily so much of a difference in my teaching, but there was a difference in the student body and the way that they reacted to that teaching. And so in the mainstream university, I would say the majority of my students were willing to listen to me, but they weren't very as open to these ideas about parapsychology or consciousness beyond the brain. But by the end of the semester, many of them would come to me and say, you know what, I still don't totally buy into what you're saying, but I appreciate this course because you made me think a little bit about some of the underlying assumptions of this mainstream approach that I've been taught in, and I feel like I'm a bit more, I'm a better critical thinker now. And so I always appreciated that. And of course, at Aleph Trust, the students come in much more open to these, what you could call alternative views on consciousness. But at the same time, sometimes they're a little too far in that direction, not being as critical about some of these post-materialist views on consciousness, for example. And so we have to pull them back a little bit and get them critical thinking in the other direction. So it goes both ways, really.
Because with the current status of consciousness studies, we've got an explosion of very neuroscience sort of brain function theories. Virtually every week I sort of read an article of some new theory that's been proposed. So I think last week the emergentism has come through again. So what's your sense of the current state of play with consciousness studies?
That is a $1 million question in a way, because I was just reading an article earlier this week that created not really an infographic, really just a table of all the different materialist and post-materialist consciousness theories that this particular author could find. It was extremely comprehensive. You've probably seen it, but I'll send it to you just in case you haven't. And the sheer number of theories in this table, the font is this big. It's just so many theories. And in some ways, I'm of two minds about this. I guess, I don't know if that pun is intended or not, but I'm of two minds. So on the one hand, I think that a proliferation of theories is a good thing because it shows that there's interest. People are interested. They're coming up with ideas. They're, in some cases, communicating with each other about these ideas. So there's some of these adversarial collaborations, for example, where they sort of pit certain theories against each other and study them. So I think that's all great. There's also a thought process that goes through my mind, and I know it's shared by some others as well, of, things are becoming too muddled. Like we're getting too much into the weeds. We're not communicating with each other enough, and we're reinventing the wheel by just coming up with slightly more fine-grained theories. And to be honest, as someone who, as we've talked about, I'm a module leader on this course. In some ways, you might expect me to be an expert on these theories of consciousness, but there is no way that I can know about all of these theories or explain all of them. I know many of them in broad strokes, but there's so many that it almost gets a little bit diluted. And I think that the field in general would benefit from a lot more dialogue between theories, between theoretical perspectives, between people who actually disagree with each other, and dialogue or even debate a little bit, which can really be helpful. I watched a podcast recently, which was a long it really was just a conversation between Bernardo Kastrup and Christoph Koch. And they were, I don't know if you've seen this one, but it's almost 2 hours long, where they're just riffing about their various theories. And so, Christoph's theory is integrated information theory. Bernardo's talking about analytic idealism. And what I loved about this podcast is that even though there's several points upon which they perhaps disagree, or, Koch was saying things like, well, I don't get this. Like, what do you mean the entire universe is mental? This makes no sense to me. I want to test this in my laboratory right now. But they were laughing, they were smiling, they were collegial about the discussion. And by the end, they started to come to some potentially testable ideas because they took the time to speak with each other, as opposed to just saying my theory is the best one and shutting out all of the rest of the theories.
Yes, I agree. I think there's a bit of both going on. I mean, I've noticed that, and it does seem to be a feature of sort of mainstream stuff, but also other alternative theories can be exclusive as well. But there is this sense that sometimes that, we've got the right theory because it's scientifically testable, whereas the other theory isn't. But at the same time, I think there have been some sort of competitive collaborations, haven't there, recently? So different researchers with these different theories have been getting together and trying to sort of, I was going to say outdo one another, but they've been trying to cooperate, although they still have those perhaps useful differences.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, in my view, this is what good science is when people, I think it was maybe Charles Eisenstein who said something about science as being a state of humble not knowing in the face of the great mystery. And I think that that's really the right way to do it. Whereas many scientists believe that they're being scientific and objective by sticking to a certain view, a certain theory, or to specific metaphysical assumptions that they don't even realize they hold.
Yes.
We talk about this often in our course, but materialism, the idea that matter is the fundamental nature of reality and that's it, the end. That's an underlying metaphysical assumption to most of science that very few people ever question or talk about, or even are willing to entertain a different idea because it's seen as perhaps sacrilegious in some way. And so this is where science, the science of consciousness included, can start to become really dogmatic and rigid. And that's when I think we start to get into trouble, because the whole point of science a few hundred years ago was to get away from the dogmatic aspects of religion, and it's sort of twisted in on itself and in some ways become dogmatic in its own right.
Yes, I mean, probably a bit too much, but I tend to take a both and rather than an either or. So rather than say, we'll accept this body of data or information, but we'll reject that body, I try and say, how do we understand these two perhaps disparate pieces of information together? It can happen both ways, though, because I've noticed that our students tend to reject neuroscience without really getting to grips with some of the arguments. Mm-hmm. So it's not necessarily sort of mainstream to alternative. It can be the other way around as well. So how do you think we could get over that sort of resistance?
Well, sometimes I'm like you in the sense that I tend to follow this perhaps more of a both and perspective. And sometimes I almost feel like I'm being a politician because I give non-answers. People will say, well, which theory do you like the best? Or, well, what do you think, Bethany? And I'll say, well, I think this and this. And it ends up in a way coming across as a non-answer. But I think we could actually do with a little more non-answers in our scientific pursuits. It's that humility, I think. Part of getting past this standstill of, it's this approach or this approach, is that I think in some ways it can be both. An example that I sometimes use is my interest in synchronicity. And so part of what I think the way that synchronicity operates is it operates in a cognitive way. So when I experience a synchronicity, it gives me an internal narrative that gives me a sense of meaning about a particular aspect of my life. And sure, I might be completely making that up. Who knows? But it is operating in this sort of way. But I think that synchronicity is perhaps also operating in a deeper way that's giving us clues about the fundamental nature of reality. And I don't think that either of those have to exclude each other. I think they can both be happening at the same time. And I think that if people on all sides of these different theories and debates could just be a little more open to the idea that the other person's perspective, or at least some facets of their perspective, might actually be happening at the same time as their own favored perspective. And just entering into some of these dialogues, I think, could really help.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's Ken Wilber who said no tradition's sort of stupid enough to be wrong 100% of the time. So I think that was his thing of trying to bring these different aspects together. But I think, why do you think the taboo against sort of transpersonal experiences in parapsychology is so strong, particularly in sort of neuroscience and psychology?
I think that, in many cases, I think that modern science and modern scientists have this identity associated with being a good scientist. And being a good scientist means being neutral and objective and not buying into any wishy-washy spiritual, religious stuff. And I think that this is really actually tied into people's identities, and that it's in many ways cool. It's cool to be cynical. It's cool to not believe in anything beyond what you can see, and we all just die and that's the end. It's kind of a nihilistic view in a way, but it's cool in some ways. It's hip to think that way. And I think that many scientists, to their credit, really want to do good science and feel that if they veer too far in these directions, they won't be doing good science anymore, and that they'll be doing a disservice to their enterprise, to what they do. And I think that holds very, very strongly, even career-wise. If you mention that you're interested in certain topics, parapsychology, for example, you can get kind of ostracized or shunned, or people will tell you, if you're a PhD student, well, that's career suicide. Don't go into that. There's nothing for you there. There's no grant funding. There's no job positions, which in some ways is true. It's not that they're lying. And so I think that some of it actually gets tied up into ego and identity, in the same way, though, that people on the more post-materialist or transpersonal side can also get tied up. If someone's had a really strong spiritual experience that they believe is really true, their spiritual ego can get tied up into that and go in that direction and not be willing to consider the more materialist perspective. So I also think that goes in both directions.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I mean, I remember reading in one of your articles, which was talking about the bias against parapsychology in the sort of mainstream, is that when you were teaching on that sort of mainstream, more or less mainstream course, when you were talking about neuroscience, the students never looked at their mobile phones to check what you were saying is valid. But when you brought up parapsychology, immediately the phones would come out and they'd be double checking the sort of works you cited to see what the critiques were, and they become far more critical thinkers. So you detected a double standard there, but you did some study of that, didn't you? A sort of more formal study.
Yes. That's the inspiration for that study came from that mainstream university that I was teaching at, as you said, because I found it really interesting that phenomenon was happening, and I welcomed it with the parapsychology research. I liked that my students were developing their critical thinking skills in that way. We'd have a 5-10 minute comfort break, and I'd come back and they would have all looked up some articles. And to me, that shows they're engaged and they're not just going out and smoking a cigarette and not caring what I was talking about. And they'd come back and be all like, oh, well, look, I found this article that totally discredits what you just said. I'm like, oh, great. Well, let's talk about that. Let's pick apart that article. And I would often say to my students, it's okay to be skeptical, but you need to be an informed skeptic. You need to actually pick up an article on parapsychology and read it, and then you can critique it, as opposed to just blanket statements that the entire field is irrelevant and fraudulent, for example. And so this research that I ended up doing was I wrote a summary, an abstract for a scientific article, And it was the exact same wording, in a sense, the exact same numbers, but in one condition, the participants were exposed to the abstract as if the results were referring to a parapsychology article, and the other group were exposed to the summary, but it was referring to a neuroscience article. But the numbers were the same, the statistical significance, all these things that you would look for. And the participants were people with a background in psychology. They had to be at least an undergraduate student so that they would be able to understand to some extent this summary that they were reading. And I asked them after they read it to evaluate it on things like how valid they thought it was, whether they thought the results would be repeatable, etc. And the research showed that the participants rated the neuroscience article as being more valid and more credible than the parapsychology article, even though, as I said, the wording, aside from just changing a couple of words about neuroscience versus parapsychology, and then the numbers were exactly the same.
So that's very interesting. So that's sort of statistical evidence that there is that systematic bias there. I mean, did you, when you were teaching these courses, did you ever get a sense on how you might overcome that? Did you ever get people shifting their views, perhaps?
Well, one story that I often share about that particular course was, I'll come around to answering that question in a second. What I'll share is how hard it can actually be to get people to shift their views, because in that particular class, one of the required readings was a 2018 meta-analysis by Etzel Cardenia on research on parapsychology, and a really well-done meta-analysis, followed many of the standards. It was published in a mainstream academic journal, American Psychologist, and the students had to read that, and then we would have a discussion about it. And as part of that discussion, I would ask, did any of you change your mind about parapsychology after reading this meta-analysis? Because for many of them, it was the first parapsychology article they were ever assigned to read in a course. And there was these two students sitting beside each other, and they both said, no, I didn't change my mind. And I was like, okay. And I assumed, because of where I was teaching, that they were both more on the mainstream side. And so I said to the one student, okay, well, what were your views before and why didn't they change? And he said, oh, well, I still think, I thought parapsychology was just fraudulent and not real. And I still think it's fraudulent and not real. I was like, okay. And then I said to the other student, what were your beliefs before? What do you think now? And she was like, oh, I've had many psi phenomena happen to me. I believed it was real. And I read this article and now I still believe it's real. So my mind didn't change. So, again, I'll go back to Charles Eisenstein, he wrote an article called A State of Belief is a State of Being.
Yes.
And it's this idea that your beliefs can be so ingrained that you can read the exact same information, but still not change your mind, even though the information in that article had effect sizes, for example. It had statistical evidence that was just as strong as the statistical evidence for other phenomena in social psychology, for example, in more mainstream areas of psychology. But a student would read the exact same meta-analysis with social psychology in it and be like, well, yeah, no, this is fine. I get this. So to answer your question, I don't think you can force anyone to change their mind. I mean, it's like this just in life, in our personal relationships, anywhere. Yeah. You can't force people to change. You can present them with information, and even then they might still reject it. Like this one student who was like, no, I still don't believe it. I think you can model. I think one of the most effective ways to inspire behavior change is to model it. So I try to model to my students being open, just being open to a variety of perspectives, to see if they sort of pick up on that. Like, oh, maybe that's actually good science, like being open-minded about things, not just immediately dismissing something. And I've found, at least in my teaching, that tends to be one of the most effective ways, is me just modeling it myself. And particularly not dismissing their point of view. If they have a materialist point of view, making it very clear that I'm open to that point of view and to considering it, and not just throwing it out the window. And then, as I was mentioning, at the end of the semester, some, not all, but some of these students would come back to me and say, well, yeah, like I feel a little more open now. And they appreciated that about the course.
Yes, I think there was a sociologist, Jeremy Northcote, who
wrote about this, and he looked at the debate between sort of psi advocates and counter advocates. And he said one of the things he noticed was that each sort of polarized faction refused to take each other's arguments seriously. And since I read that, so I've sort of tried to keep that in mind and say, am I just thoughtlessly dismissing an alternate viewpoint because I don't like it? Or I do think it's an important skill actually to be able to engage with ideas. I think that there's fear sometimes. I think it's where it comes to sort of believer versus skeptic, that being a believer is the worst thing you can be if you're a scientist, because you're not supposed to believe anything. So if you say, oh, well, I think there might be something in the paranormal phenomena or whatever, people say, well, oh, that means you've just lost your skepticism and critical thinking and become a believer. And it's kind of the polar opposite of sort of religious belief, if you like. It's like the worst thing you can be. And I noticed that actually a lot in my own academic background. I think it's like you were saying earlier, that it's kind of almost a macho thing to say, oh, well, I'm really skeptical and critical. And you lose that if you sort of shift your views a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And I think that, this way that we put on these, you could call it a mask or a mask. It's a professional mask. As a professor, as a scientist, I'm supposed to be this macho, stoic. There's so many words that you could use and not believe in anything. But when you have enough of these types of experiences that, the likelihood of them happening by chance are so low, it's hard to ignore those in many ways. And I think that you can believe in these types of experiences and still not go off the deep end and just not have any critical thinking skills left. And I think that actually, parapsychology research has done really a service to psychology research more generally, because methodologically, these scientists have had to become so rigorous with their methodologies, because they know that when they do a study, it is going to get critiqued from every which angle. And so they sometimes do triple, quadruple blind protocols. And so in many ways, when people say that psi is a pseudoscience, it drives me crazy, because it's, these many, not all, of course, it's like any enterprise. Sure, there are some researchers who are doing shoddy research that maybe isn't the best methodologically, but there's many psi researchers out there who are developing very rigorous, very well done experimental protocols that would rival many of the protocols that are done in other areas of psychology. So I think that you can believe in things like psi phenomena or synchronicity and still be open-minded and critical about them at the same time.
Yes, I think it's not appreciated that actually with parapsychology, there have been decades, pretty much a century. We've pretty much got 90 to 100 years of experimental parapsychology now. And over that time, it's been rigorously critiqued right from the beginning. But, there are issues. So there's things like replication, possible experimental error, but all of those issues have actually been sort of poured over in these debates at length. And I think parapsychology has actually been very responsive to positively changing practices in alignment with those critiques.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's a great example of open-mindedness to in science and changing your protocols, pre-registering your studies. In parapsychology, they were among some of the first to be pre-registering studies online, saying exactly what they were going to do online and publishing that so that they don't deviate from that at all. And so it doesn't look like they're data fishing, for example. And I think these are great examples of good science that really get easily dismissed by people who are not true skeptics, but are uninformed skeptics.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so let's move on a little bit to you've been mentioned synchronicity a couple of times. So could you explain what synchronicity actually is and who originated the term?
Yeah, so synchronicity, it's a term that was originally coined by Carl Jung. And from Jung's perspective, a synchronicity was or is a situation where a mental event occurs that is very closely in time paralleled by an external physical event. So they're similar in some way to each other, with no apparent causal explanation. And when I say causal, I mean the more traditional ways that we would think about causality, that A causes B. So, and most of that is materialist and physicalist. So without a clear physical way for why this mental phenomena would be linked to this physical phenomenon. And importantly for Jung, these two phenomena are interconnected by meaning as well. So it's very meaningful for the person. And so Jung used synchronicity often in his therapeutic practices as a therapeutic tool, because people would find meaning in these types of situations and then feel guided or go in certain directions on their life path. That's a Jungian perspective, and many people follow that perspective on synchronicity. There's some perhaps more modern researchers. One of them is a medical doctor named Bernard Beitman, and he's developed a more perhaps nuanced series of definitions of different types of what he calls meaningful coincidences. So these are perhaps slightly broadened view of what Jung was doing. So meaningful coincidences could, for example, be two physical events co-occurring or two mental events. They don't necessarily have to be a mental event paralleled by a physical event. And sometimes some of what Beitman came up with were coincidences that happen that have no meaning. Sometimes you don't know. You're just like, oh, this happened. I saw 10 orange umbrellas today, and I'm not sure why, but it's not really meaningful to me. So, there's some different definitions, but most of them, at least the ones that I'm interested in, usually involve meaningful coincidences in some way between two events that don't seem to be causally linked in any way that you can readily explain.
Okay, so can you give an example from your own life?
Yes, let me think here. There's a few examples that I often use. One that perhaps I'll use because it's a good example from a Jungian perspective, but it also has features of parapsychology, which we were just talking about, is a precognitive dream that I had once. And I've written about this and spoken about it a couple of times, but some people might not have heard it before. This is a dream that I had while I was at a retreat. So I was at a personal growth, personal development retreat. And when I'm at those retreats, I always log my dreams. Like I always write my dreams down. And I had this dream that a Rottweiler dog came up behind me and bit me on the arm. And I was obviously in pain and I was bleeding and I was crying, but no one came to help me. And I was very upset. And I wrote this dream down. And then I completely forgot about the dream. And a few months later, I think it was around 3 months later, my mom was out for a walk. And a Rottweiler dog attacked her from behind and bit her on the arm in the exact place from my dream. And my mom was bleeding and the dog's owner did nothing to help her. And she walked home bleeding and crying and no one helped her. And she eventually got to the hospital and had to have stitches. And she eventually filed a lawsuit and won a lawsuit against this dog's owner. It was a pretty serious situation. And even then, I didn't remember that I'd had this dream. It wasn't until a couple of months after that I was going through this journal. Just for some reason, it fell off my bookshelf or whatever. And I saw this dream. And because I'd written it down and it was dated, it was a very clear and nice example of, wow, like I had the breed of dog, the location of the bite, the fact that I was crying and no one helped me. And then this happened to my mom a few months later. So from a Jungian perspective, that would be an internal mental event that was paralleled in time by an external event. And the meaning aspect is a little less clear, perhaps, because it's not that the dream helped my mom. It didn't prevent the situation. But I interpret it as, someone who's interested in synchronicity in general, they are just meaningful to me in the sense that they, like we were talking about a moment ago, they make me more of a believer in the sense that they suggest very strongly to me that there's more going on in this universe than we're currently aware of. And that gives me a sense of meaning that, the secrets of the universe. As when we started talking today, I mentioned that I've always been interested in life's big questions. And so when these synchronistic events happen to me, they're extremely meaningful from a personal and professional perspective. So that's just one example.
So I'm going to put the skeptic hat on for a second and say, oh, well, human beings, our brains are geared towards finding patterns, even in meaningless noise. It's coincidences are bound to happen, statistically speaking, sometimes extraordinary coincidences. So do you think would be any way of distinguishing between a genuine synchronicity and something that's just coincidental?
I like the skeptic hat because I think about this all the time. I'm so skeptical of research on synchronicity because there isn't a lot of it for this exact reason, because it is extremely difficult to do a proper lab-based randomized control type trial on synchronicity because they are spontaneous. They happen in ways that sometimes seem random and strange, and it can be difficult to artificially create that in a lab. And I think that, in this particular case, what I really like, as I was mentioning, is that I did write it down and date it. And so I know that it happened before the event happened to my mom. And I wrote down the exact details, which then were confirmed by my mom. And so that one, I often use it as an example because to me, it's very clear. Now, of course, it could be random. But when I really, I'm into statistics. I do statistical analyses and quantitative research. And when I think about what are the odds, like, of course, the odds are probably high that I would dream about my mom because she's close to me. I care about her, etc. But what are the odds that I would dream about the exact breed of dog and the exact bite? And of course, it was biting me, not my mom. So I wasn't even dreaming about my mom. I was dreaming about myself. But, my mom and I are perhaps connected in that way. But what are the odds? Statistically, you could perhaps somehow calculate the odds of dreaming about a Rottweiler biting you in the arm. And I think that the odds are so low, so exceptionally low, that would then happen to someone I love. To me, there's just, sure, in the population of 7 billion people on the earth and with a big enough data set, strange things do happen and they can happen. But to me, that particular example is so specific that I don't really see a lot of other plausible explanations. I mean, or how would I put it? Sure, the big data explanation is plausible, but I think that the synchronicity, psi, some underlying nature of reality that is perhaps conscious is equally plausible as the big data argument in this situation. And I don't think either one is stronger or weaker than the other. And so I tend to lean more in the synchronicity direction in that particular case.
I mean, I think there are similar issues with precognitive dreams. That's dreams where people dream the future or think they're dreaming the future. The same arguments about sort of coincidence and the unlikelihood of, despite something being unlikely, it can happen, are also valid there. But for me, it's the same thing that when you look at a lot of the case studies, or, I've had a few precognitive or apparently precognitive experiences myself. It's the specificity of the dream, that it's quite often a very specific detail that tips the scale. So it's not just the generic, so you're not, dreaming of a plane crash, you're dreaming of something that's much more specific. And some of the best case studies seem very specific indeed. There was it's actually in the book, but there was a case that I collected of this woman who seemed to have a precognitive experience over a number of weeks of a school shooting in the UK. Now school shootings in the UK are very rare. And I think, again, it's the specificity of it. And I thought some of these experiences, they seem to go beyond coincidence, and they seem to be very powerful in a way that I think sort of generic anomalous psychology, it's not psychic, but it looks like it, is strained at the very least.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that's where I think that, when we were talking about how sometimes more mainstream folks will say that people who lean towards more of these post-materialist perspectives are deluding themselves, thinking, believing in something that's just weird and far-fetched. But in my view, sort of believing in this big data explanation for everything is equally far-fetched. And I'll admit that there are times when I experience what I would call synchronicities, but that aren't as strong. They're not as strong as the example I just gave. And sometimes I am kind of reaching a little bit like, ooh, that's interesting, but it feels like a little more of a reach or a stretch. But it's fun. Like I enjoy thinking in that way, and I don't really see any harm in it as long as it's not leading to me hurting anybody or having a really, a psychotic break with reality, for example. So why not think in that way? But I think that when you want to get a little more scientific about it, it's challenging, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible. And I think that the more challenging scientific questions are actually the ones that are most worth studying. And to me, synchronicity being a difficult research topic actually makes it exciting to study. And I often think of, and others have used this example as well, of black holes. Einstein developed the math for black holes decades before we actually had physical evidence and had seen one. And even Einstein was kind of like, I don't know about this. I don't know if this is actually a possibility. And now we've seen them through technology. And people are like, okay, black holes are real. And I think something similar could eventually happen with some of these phenomena that, like synchronicity or psi phenomena, that are very subtle and very difficult to put your fingers on. But there are people, for example, who have come up with mathematical models for synchronicity. Using, one of them is using Fibonacci sequences. And I'm not a mathematician, so, it's kind of out of my scope, but I know enough of it to say that it's interesting that people are coming up with math behind it that could eventually lead to maybe computational models or other types of models, or we might eventually have a technology that somehow detects some of these phenomena in better ways than we currently have. So I think just throwing it all out offhand is just not the way I would go.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I remember one skeptic in a meeting at the Royal Statistical Society actually said about the synchronicity theory, it's meaningless. And I thought, well, it's a theory of meaning. How can you say it's meaningless? But I think when you're, with the scientific materialism, which is this sort of belief system, maybe scientism is a better word, that the universe has no purpose, that things are meaningless. They don't, it's either, you've got sort of mechanical causation or you've got chance. Those are the two possible broad types of explanations. You've got nothing else, basically. So if it's not the product of sort of mechanics, it's a product of chance. So any of these coincidences have to be just due to chance. But I think at the beginning of this year, I was having to do some statistics training. So we were looking at chance. And one thing I learned, I think, is how difficult probability actually is in maths and statistics. But it's also how ignorant we are of what's actually going on there. I mean, I think Arthur Koestler was big on this, that we don't actually quite understand the metaphysics of chance and probability either. So just to say, that just explains everything isn't really adequate to what's going on.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, there's, in statistics, we often use this, there's a less than 5% chance that something occurred by chance, this p less than 0.05. And there's statisticians out there, hardcore statisticians, who argue that that's arbitrary and that we should be using some different ways of doing our statistics. Whereas, people who aren't as maybe trained in statistics will just look at a scientific study and say, statistical significance, that means it's true, the end. And really, there's a very nuanced debate among statisticians about what probability is and how it functions. And even, when you were speaking about meaning, it made me think of dual aspect monism, which was actually a theory developed in part by physicists. And the whole the crux of that theory is about the universe being fundamentally meaningful, that actually meaning is one of the fundamental aspects of the universe, and that's not just due to chance. And when they say meaning, it's not necessarily human meaning, like the meanings we come up with, but meaning with a capital M, like at some deeper level that we perhaps don't quite understand. But they've also come up with mathematical models to help explain some of this. So the entire debate around all of this is much more nuanced than a lot of people realize.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's a difference maybe between lots of sort of pop science writers and broadcasters who still very much stick to the everything's meaningless and purposeless. We live in this maybe even hostile universe. And actually some of the I think there has been some metaphysical shift. I think certainly in the philosophy of consciousness, in saying that in the 17th century with Galileo, a lot of qualities of the universe were sort of left out to have a science that was based on mechanics, like Galileo's science. And that this has been the problem, that basically for a while you had dualism, where there was this assumption that there was a mind that was somehow completely separate from the universe. And then in the sort of 19th and 20th century, people said, well, we can't have that. But what you've got left, if you just chuck the subjective side away, is just this mechanical, purposeless universe. So do you sense a little bit of a sea change in the last few years, that people are starting to understand that was an important submission? Bit of a leading question, I know, but
yeah, I've thought about this, and sometimes I'm not sure. Sometimes I wonder, because I would agree with you. That's what I feel is happening as well. And sometimes I'm not sure, though, if it's because of the bubble in which I live with the Aleph Trust and kind of more transpersonal perspectives. And so I'm surrounded by people who think this way, and in these views of more perhaps open views towards post-materialism, for example. So I'm not entirely sure. I do think that that's perhaps happening. And again, this might be because of the people I'm surrounded by, but I think people are starting to more see the connections between the way that having a materialist view of the earth and of humanity is actually detrimental on a larger scale in terms of us, the ways that we're destroying each other in the earth, for example. And so I think that perhaps there's a growing understanding, or at least recognition of that, and people are looking for alternate perspectives.
That's actually brings us quite neatly to your paper on the dark night of the soul and the current ecological crisis. I'll briefly say that I tend to concur, and I think because at one time I too held a very mainstream sort of materialist view, sort of cognitive science view, and although it wasn't really about rejecting that, it was more that I still think that's a very powerful approach. I mean, if you look at modern day neuroscience, it's achieving real wonders, and I think that would be the first thing sort of a very mainstream sort of materialist neuroscientists would say. They would say, look, we're understanding memory, we're able to scan the brain in unprecedented detail, in real time. We're getting a much better handle on a lot of the sort of underlying processes in the brain. And I think the assumption is that research will just continue until everything is solved. But so from one perspective, it's been very successful. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that high level of success. But it's very funny. It's almost like it's a two-dimensional success, because at the same time, it's like you said, we're facing this ecological crisis. And environmental philosopher Rupert Reed, who I have a very high regard for his work, he said entirely independently that he thinks what he calls our civilizational crisis, which includes things like climate breakdown, the sixth extinction, etc., is a spiritual crisis. And he's a bit vague about what that means. But I think, get the sense from reading that paper of yours that you started thinking along the same lines. So could you say something about that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, what first came to me when you were saying that is, it relates actually to what we were speaking about a moment ago. To me, it's a crisis of meaning. It's a spiritual crisis. It's a crisis of meaning, because as we've discussed, it's cool to just be like, nothing means anything, everything's meaningless, whatever. And that means that we mistreat each other. We mistreat the earth because none of it means anything anyway. So who cares? And that type of approach is extremely dangerous and detrimental to humankind, to animals, to the planet. And I think that, in that paper that I wrote, I was writing about this sense that I get. And people sometimes get triggered by that paper. They don't like it because sometimes they think that I'm saying that everything's just happening as it should be, and it's okay. Because in that paper, I'm arguing in a sense that there is perhaps some reason why this ecological crisis of ours is happening that's beyond our understanding at the moment, but that might be clear later on. And so, even though it's not good, a lot of what we're doing, what humans are doing to the earth, there's perhaps some way in which it is instigating a dark night of the soul for humanity and for the earth itself. And as we know from research and from spiritual and religious traditions, a dark night of the soul is often a very difficult period that leads to transformation of some sort. And often on the other side of it, the person feels that they've grown and changed in some fundamental way in their identity. And it's possible that humanity needs to go through this collective near-death experience, in a sense, to wake up and for things to change. And that perhaps even the Earth herself needs to go through some sort of a transformation for reasons that perhaps we just don't understand.
I've got a lot of sympathy for that idea. I mean, first of all, just explain a little bit more where the idea of the dark night of the soul came from.
Yeah, so the dark night of the soul it came from Christian perspectives, where the idea that there's times when many Christian mystics or just people very deep within Christianity would feel that God had abandoned them. Even Jesus on the cross, Father, why have you forsaken me? This sense that there's a moment that happens where the person feels deeply abandoned by God and feels very alone. Saint Teresa of Avila felt similar. Also, Mother Teresa, people think of Mother Teresa as this saint that was always maybe just happy and doing great things, but she had something like a 40-year dark night of the soul where she felt that God was absent to her. And it's this idea that when the person feels that God is absent, it's actually when God is most present, and that there's deep work happening that the person is perhaps not aware of, but that they come out on the other side feeling, re-engaged with God and feeling God's presence again, and changed fundamentally in their own personality and in their own life. And this has been secularized like many things, and so it doesn't have to be related to God anymore, but it can just be a dark night of the soul in a person's life where they go through a really challenging time and they grow and they change as a result of that, and they see gifts from it. So that's what the dark night of the soul is.
Yes, I think without romanticizing depression is something I've suffered from myself. Very often people who are in recovery, or that people might go through a period, it's a bit like mourning, really, except you don't necessarily need something to mourn about. It just perhaps happens. That to make meaning of that experience, it's important to be that it's part of a process, that there's something on the other side. I mean, I'm going to push back a tiny bit on your paper, because a little bit, because I saw this writer, Jem Bendell, he sort of thought along he thinks we're in a lot of trouble ecologically and in terms of civilization. And I think he was sort of listening to the idea that there's going to be this global spiritual transformation, and we're all going to sort of emerge the other end, purified beings. I think his concern was that perhaps it was a bit sort of Euro or Western centric, and maybe a little bit anthropocentric as well. So the concern, I think, is that basically screwing up quite badly in terms of burning fossil fuels, etc., and sort of dismantling ecosystems. But we're giving ourselves a starring role if we say that, oh, well, this is just really a dark night of the soul. I mean, do you think that kind of criticism could be addressed?
Well, I think it's a really valid criticism. And so in that paper, well, I'll mention two things. So in that paper, I raised the idea of it being an anthropocentric approach. I think that it's not just about us. I think it's actually about the Earth's transformation. So in a way, I don't know if this is a good analogy or not, but see it like the cells in our body. There is certain ways that cells commit suicide, for example, and they do it for reasons that sometimes help our body. And so in my view, it might actually be that like humans are our vessel creating this dark night of the soul for the Earth, because the Earth actually has to go through some sort of transformation that we don't fully understand, that perhaps might actually involve humans becoming extinct, and maybe there's some new species that arises. And so when I originally wrote that paper, this is the other part of this, I actually had a whole section on a future with no humans, and everyone got way too freaked out by that section and thought it was no. And so I had to take it out eventually. That paper, I had a really hard time with the peer review process. But the original version of that paper, I talked about not necessarily that we're having this grand spiritual awakening and we're all going to be these enlightened, fully conscious beings, whatever that means, after this dark night of the soul, but that actually creation, the universe, whatever you want to call it, has a destructive aspect to it as well. Death is a really important part of the universe. And not sometimes, stars do die, planets die, species go extinct without any human influence. There have been species on this planet that have gone like dinosaurs, when humans weren't around. So this does happen. And perhaps there's some way in which humans are just part of a much bigger process that may or may not involve us in the future. And so in some ways, this helps me cope with a lot of the angst that I get over environmental issues. And so perhaps it's just a big, huge coping mechanism I've made for myself, and I'm open to that idea. But that, I can do my best. I can do my best with environmental activism and the various steps that I would want to take. But as with many things, I need to release my attachment to the outcome of those steps that I take. And hope for the best, but trust that there is perhaps something bigger going on that I don't fully understand.
I really like that phrase, sort of releasing any attachment to the outcome. I've sort of read that in some environmental writings before. So there's the idea that this can be quite an egocentric thing, actually. Activists might want to change the world. So it's like last week I was on a Restore Nature Now march in London, and it was very big, and there were lots of people coming along, and it's very empowering. But then at the same time, you think, well, maybe this is just egocentric. We've got to save the world. Maybe that's a kind of immaturity almost, of insisting that things end up how we want them to or how we think they should. But there was a book, which, I'll put these all in the show notes, called, I think it's The Road to Kanjiroba, and essentially about by an American doctor who ends up saying, well, maybe we need to think like a hospice. So we are still trying to make things better, and we're trying to reduce suffering during these very difficult times. But in the hospice, if you're working with terminally ill patients, then you have no control over the terminal illness, basically. And I think it's that release of control is very tricky for us in our culture, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it gets back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of this ego aspect, whether it's scientists or environmentalists. We can have an identity that's very tied to something, and we pick something to tie our identity to. So I am now an environmentalist, and you didn't recycle that, you are a terrible person. We'll get into this whole diatribe on that. And I think that, kind of like we were talking about at the beginning, this sort of more open-mindedness to, well, wait, humans are already sort of, for lack of a better word, like dumb enough that we're burning all these fossil fuels and everything. So do we really think we're so smart that we know what's best for the earth? Like, perhaps the earth, and so this is where that article came from, was through some meditative work I was doing, where I got this sense, almost like messages from the earth saying, it's okay, like, this isn't fun, I'm not enjoying this, but this is part of my process, and stop being so like you think you know what's best for me type of thing. And it was like, oh, that's a different way of thinking of it. And it takes that ego-centered approach and puts it to the side a little bit and creates a little more openness to what we're going through as a species.
Do you think that's why, thinking about when you think of a universe that might, after all, have some kind of inherent meaning or purpose or interconnectedness, do you think that's one important shift that we can make? So one of the problems that I have with scientific materialism is that it cuts you off from any of that kind of possibility. That means you're just this isolated ego, which is supposed to be illusory anyway, in a mechanical unit. In environmental terms, actually, a very disempowering perspective. And that's why I think but once you shift a little bit and you open yourself to the possibility that you might get, I think you need to be careful with, I'm getting messages from the earth. I can understand how that can be dysfunctional as well. But at the same time, I think a lot of environmental writers do have that sense that they suddenly connect with the earth, or with some aspects like a forest or the sea or animals. And I think that connection, I think it has to be real on some level.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sometimes the way that I like to think of it is that even if it's not real, like real, what is real? We could have a whole other episode on that. Mm-hmm. But even if it's not real, if it's not hurting anyone and if it's actually beneficial in some way. So I agree with you. If you're receiving messages from the earth that you're supposed to go out and kill people, like that's obviously not helpful. But if whatever meaning you are picking up on, whether you're making it all up in your head, you know, even if it comes to synchronicity, whatever, if it helps you feel guided and purposeful and it benefits you and other people and animals and plants and everything around you, then why not think in that way? Of course, also keeping an open mind to the fact that it might not be entirely true or real. Now, of course, I tend to lean more towards thinking that it is real in some way that we, again, don't fully understand, but there's some underlying structure or information layer, some aspect of reality that we as humans don't often know how to tap into, but that sometimes we do, whether in meditation or altered states in some ways, or in a near-death experience, for example. That layer is there, and that perhaps if we don't annihilate ourselves as a species, we will eventually scientifically learn more about what that is. But in the meantime, I think that infusing your life with meaning is beneficial in many respects, as long as you're not harming yourself or others.
For me, it's quite often in a natural environment. If you go to a forest or something, it's infused with meaning. It's not very often. I think this is again another effect of having this very sort of materialist view that oh well, my life is meaningless, but you can give your life its own meaning. So your ego becomes responsible for that in a way. And I've always had a problem with that, because I thought when I go into a forest, it's more like a sense of connection and being a part of it, but also life. You know, the life is so rich that it's like last year I went to Bardia National Park in Nepal, to the Sal Forest, and just the Jeep broke down, basically. We were standing in this forest where there might be tigers and leopards and things, and it just felt, the whole thing just felt alive. And I thought no one could tell me that the universe is meaningless standing here.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't know if you've heard of the book Braiding Sweetgrass, but it's a really beautiful book where the author, you know, has North American indigenous background and writes about how, you know, many of these cultures, it wasn't just like that's a tree. The tree is a being, is infused with its own life and meaning, and is kin. So it's actually your relative in a way. And I might get this next part wrong, but if I'm remembering it correctly, in the grammar, like the actual linguistic structure, you wouldn't say that lake. Like you wouldn't point at a lake and say that lake. The structure is actually to be a lake. Like the lake is a being. As a
verb, not a noun. Yeah,
exactly. And I think that you know, many of us who weren't raised in those types of cultures, we have to almost relearn how to communicate and be with the natural world in that way, because we're used to like, you are that, not even you, that is a thing, and I am a being. But I'm the same as you. I'm with a tree and I'm like, this is a being. Look at its little face, and it has a personality to me that, you know, that I really sense. And I think that that's a way to interact with the world that actually creates a lot less harm than what many of us are currently doing.
I do. I mean, I think in some ways we're tiptoeing around the word sacred, aren't we? So whatever you understand by the word, I think it's a lot harder to chop down a forest or whatever if you think it's a sacred. And you know, I think again, there's a statistic that a large chunk of the world's remaining biodiversity is where indigenous cultures also are, because that they still have that sense. You know, a lot of indigenous cultures still have that sense of deep connection and sort of the living universe, really. And it's very funny, actually. I think it's one of the things that very, very often gets lost in these debates between, you know, sort of skeptic versus believer debates that I've noticed. And I thought this is why when I noticed very similar patterns in environmental writing, I thought it was worth bringing that together, because you think, oh, well, the same issues exist in that field as well as the sort of fields of psychology and neuroscience. I mean, I think that's quite often missed in those debates.
Yes, absolutely. I think some of these larger overarching issues in, for example, like polarization is another way to put it, that we just become polarized in whatever our view is, whether it's an environmental view, a scientific view, and we get so rigid and dogmatic and stuck to it that we actually miss out on opportunities for growth and for transformation and for learning by being a little bit more open-minded.
Okay, so I think we're coming kind of to the end of the time. So do you have any thoughts on consciousness, where you'd like to see consciousness science going, say, in the next 10 years or so?
I mean, two things come to mind at first. I mean, one is just generally kind of what we've been discussing, a little more open-mindedness from the materialist side. I don't want materialism to go away. I don't want neuroscience to go away. But, I brought up a little while ago this conversation between Bernardo Kastrup and Christoph Koch that I really liked, because Koch is a great example of a neuroscientist, traditional materialist neuroscientist, who over time has been slowly kind of shifting some ideas, but he still holds some of the original ideas, and he'll still debate, but he's open-minded to it. And I'd love to see more of that, more conversations between people with different views, but also, and this is the second part, more of these adversarial collaborations I would love to see, where, and not just, right now they're mostly happening in neuroscience, like testing different neuroscience theories against each other.
Yeah.
But finding ways to create testable hypotheses for some post-materialist theories and kind of pitting those against neuroscientific theories.
Yes.
And, many of the post-materialist ideas are difficult to test, trying, inducing a near-death experience and then seeing if someone, inducing a heart attack so that someone will have a near-death experience. Ethically, it's just, you can't do it. So there's challenges, but I that's where the innovation lies. And so I'd love to see innovation in finding ways to, for these different ideas to meet up a little more and not just be in their own separate camps.
Yeah. So I agree. I'd like to see a lot more collaboration, sort of meaningful dialogue, as well as, I think one of the problems is, there's a difference between debate and dialogue. So debate, I think, sometimes can be quite destructive. Very often it's assumed that's the only way. You get two parties and one of them fights to the death, and then we assume the victor has found the truth, whatever that is. But again, I like this more pluralistic approach where, and I think this is one thing that the philosopher Vera Midgley said actually once, that consciousness is too broad a topic to be left just to technical experts. So when she said that, she wasn't disparaging sort of neuroscience or psychology, but I think she was reminding us that it's a concept like time or space. Consciousness isn't just this narrow specialist field. It's actually a very broad and encompassing topic. And I think it needs a pluralistic approach.
Oh, for sure. I mean, that's something that I talk about often as well, the interdisciplinary collaboration. Like, I'm part of a Synchronicity working group as part of the Scientific and Medical Network. We meet every 6 weeks or so online, and we talk about different ideas and research. And people in that group, there's neuroscientists, there's physicists, there's philosophers, there's Jungian analysts, there's non-academics, there's all different types of people. And I think that that's really where rich dialogue and innovation can happen, is when we engage in these cross-disciplinary pursuits.
That's brilliant. Well, I think just about any time. Any time for final thoughts? Or
No, I mean, I think I would just say that I've really appreciated our conversation. I think that it's ranged through a lot of important areas that I hope people will really think about in terms of the ways that they approach what they do, whether it's scientifically or environmentally or in their day-to-day life. And just having some of that dialogue and open-mindedness, I think is key.
Yeah. And I think that's the aim for this show, really. So it's all about encouraging dialogue and different perspectives and thinking about things from different angles. Anyway, thank you so much, Bethany Butzer. Have you got any work coming up or anything you'd like to plug before we finish?
Well, actually, this year in the late summer, autumn, I'll be having a book coming out, actually with this Synchronicity working group that I just mentioned. So It's an edited volume where each of us contributed a chapter describing a personal synchronicity that's happened to us, but then also answering the question, what kind of universe makes synchronicity possible? And answering that through our various lenses, whether it's physics or math or philosophy, for example. And the book is called A Playful Universe, or The Playful Universe. And then there's Synchronicity and Consciousness in the subtitle, but it's literally just in the process of being published. So I don't know the exact title, but I know the beginning is A Playful Universe, and it's edited by Marjorie Willicott, David Lorimer, and Gary Schwartz.
What Lies Beyond with Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal, and the post-material future. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com.